This is Paul Johnson with the New Frontiers. Now, I have an interesting person today, Marty Dolan, who's running for city public advocate, which is kind of a strange position in New York City Council. But he's had kind of a ground zero seat to Mamdani, who's running for mayor, and he ran against AOC in one of his past elections. He's a Democrat, but he understands how far the Democratic Party's gone off the rails, certainly in New York and maybe around the country, and the challenges that that's creating for the Democratic brand. He also does a pretty good job of talking about how maybe getting back to simple basics for New York City might help them fix some of the big problems that they have and oftentimes the challenges that they face to trying to create a better quality of life for the people that live there. Now, I like to say on every show that I'm just an ordinary, optimistic American who believes that the United States is a great cause for good. I wrote a book about that, What's Right with America. I also have formed a political party in Arizona that is on the ballot trying to make certain that independents and unaffiliated people can participate. But what we're really looking to do is to try to find a way to bridge the gap between Democrats and Republicans and to ensure that every voter has equal access. This show and my guest, Marty, does a pretty good job of talking about that in New York and how the challenges that they have there are creating brand problems for the Democratic Party across the country. If you like what we're doing, push that button and let's get this show going.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, Marty, I'd like to welcome you to the show. And I think the right place for us to start on this is you're running in New York City for the Public City Advocate. Talk to me about that position. And also, I know that you came from the world of finance, which that's kind of a strange transition to go from the world of finance into the world of politics. Help me make the connection between those two things.
Yeah, so the New York City Public Advocate is a role that not many cities have. It's you're supposed to represent that the programs are being fairly spent across all the different voter blocks. Maybe it's the different boroughs, or maybe it's the older people or the younger people. It's tended to be used in New York as a platform for whoever the public advocate is. And the most recent public advocate, the incumbent, is a member of the DSA, the Democrat Socialists of America, and he's used it to argue for the cause of racial equality. So he's a gentleman named Jumaane Williams who goes around with love beads and starts every meeting with peace, love, and blessings, and talks in conspiracy theories about all the ways that there's racial inequality, and we know that there is racial inequality, but he really argues this at the exclusion of other things. For example, I'd like to represent the taxpayers. I think the taxpayers need representation as well, and in particular, I'd like to represent what we're doing, I think, incorrectly with our younger people. You asked about my background, so I spent 40 years working in consulting and on Wall Street. I'd like to think of myself as a business doctor. So I helped fix a lot of things that were wrong with the economy and in the insurance world. So, for example, everybody remembers the environmental crisis, and there was asbestos and there was pollution, and we helped fix all of that. We ended up finding $200 billion to help clean up the environment. People will remember, unfortunately, that the World Trade Center was knocked down, and then you had Hurricane Katrina. And so, when people talk about there's a $50 billion loss or there's a $100 billion loss, well, I was one of the guys that had to find that money to help fix things and then set it up for the future. And then we had the global financial crisis in 2008. When you had a lot of distortions in the housing market that created this terrible loss, and the world almost ended. So that's the type of stuff I've been doing for the last 40 years, which is really looking at big, complex systems, trying to figure out how to fix them so they don't get broken. again, and so that people can get on with their lives. And when I look at the political system, I look at particularly New York City is a $115 billion entity. I know, for example, that might be surprising. I know you're from Arizona, so Phoenix budget.
Yeah, that's a vastly different budget.
Phoenix budget is $3.5 billion, and New York's is $115 billion. So if you've worked around big complex businesses like I have for 40 years, that immediately tells you the problem, which is something's wrong. Like when you're operating in a scale which is per capita 4 to 5 times greater spending than another city, you really need to ask yourself, is that a good thing? And maybe that's the cause of the problem. And that's really what I bring to the table, which is a very acute sense of, kind of like a financial assessment to look at something and just spot immediately what's wrong. So what's wrong with New York City, I think, is that it's spending $115 billion very badly. And I mean, you can't spend it well on a city. And that's what we have to try to get at.
Yeah, and I want to go into that. I also want to spend some of our time talking about what's going on politically in New York City, because I think it's having an effect on politics throughout the rest of the country. And just to kind of level the playing field here, I think you and I have a couple of similarities. I've been in business for a long period of time, nothing like what you were doing in the insurance business. I've worked in both healthcare and real estate. I was a Democratic mayor. I kind of gave up on the Democratic Party some time back. I don't know if I gave up on the values. I still support things like civil rights and equal rights and human rights. It's just I also support property rights and free markets and free enterprise. I don't see those things as being inconsistent from one another. The Democratic Party I've given up on, and I became an independent about 15 or 20 years ago, and I'm the chairman of a party here locally that is the Party of Independence, but it's called the No Labels Party. And what I'm really trying to do is to find some way to bridge that common ground between the two parties. I think that the two political parties both have something good to offer. I just think that their extremists make it extremely difficult for the rest of us to work together on common sense types of proposals. But where I'm interested in New York, I'm going to talk about a couple of your races, including the fact that you've run against AOC in the past. You were or you either are or you were a Democratic a voter at one point in time. I think I can understand that from living in New York. I don't think there's a lot of leeway on that issue.
Right.
But you're working on trying to create a separate party, very similar to kind of what I'm doing. So again, there's a lot of common ground here. I don't mean to be insulting, although I might end up sounding that way a couple of times, especially as it relates to New York. And here's my starting point. I dislike what Trump is doing, trying to move in the military into taking over the crime issue in different cities. But it's not lost on me that progressives have in a large way caused this problem. The policies that they've passed, the way that they've gone about spending, their issues on dealing with everything from the homelessness to their critiques of the police departments have led to an environment where many people don't feel safe inside cities where progressives are running them. It's just a fact. And I think when you add to that, they're not really very good at being efficient at running those cities, not even the way that they might want to run them. You guys are now in this position where you're probably about to elect a Democratic socialist, Mamdani. Help me understand politically how that happens in New York. I just want to understand the politics there in a better way.
Well, I'm not sure if what's happening in New York translates at all nationally. There's this talk about whether or not what I would call the left side of the left. I call it the far left. I like to differentiate between the term progressive, which means progress, and radical. So when I talk about the left, I talk about the radicals. I was one of the people to coin that term because everybody likes progress, but radical ideas if you go back to core principles, go back to James Madison and Alexander Hamilton sitting around, creating the United States. They created a system where it's really impossible for 20% of the people to take it over, because you have the Senate that sits for 6 years, and then you kind of have to just always get 50% or 60%. You have to get to a majority to change things. But there will be pockets locally, like New York, or maybe you could imagine the very Republican area, wherever that might be, where you see things like this happen. And I think New York is going through a phase right now, but I don't think it translates nationally, because we just had an election in November of last year, which President Trump won, pretty decisively. So that's the first point. I don't think there's the proof yet that, this is some trend that's going to come out of New York. When you look at the circumstances of the race for mayor in New York, you have to understand that there are only 11% registered Republicans in New York City.
Wow.
So it's no surprise that you don't have really we have a candidate who we all know well in New York City named Curtis Sliwa. Curtis was a founder of a civic group called the Guardian Angels, and they would go around the subway and make sure that people were safe at night. And he's a really good man, but you're starting with 11% of the vote, and then you've got the Democratic Party, which is kind of split in half between what I would call the radical left and then people like me who are more in the center. And the two centrists, who are former Governor Cuomo and Mayor Eric Adams, they're splitting the vote. And then there's a radical left guy, Zohran Mamdani, who looks like, he's going to win unless two of the other candidates get out of the race. I look at it really, though, as kind of like one of those weird things. I don't see it relating to a national trend, because in my life, I get around the United States, and I think most of the United States is much more conservative, including the Democrats, than New York. So we kind of have to let New York do its thing here for a while and see what happens.
All right, so let me build my case on this, and you feel free to shoot holes at it. I'm definitely okay with that, because part of this is me trying to figure it out. So if you ask me, what Donald Trump is doing is he is moving on almost all fronts to the left. If you really take a look at what's happened over the last 30 years in politics, go from the era of Ronald Reagan and then George Bush after him, and you compare it to Donald Trump, on almost every front, he is moving to the left. And what he's doing is he's squeezing Democrats out who are being pushed further to the left. Now, the progressives, who, and let's call them, I would call the radicals the progressives, but I'm okay with saying maybe there's a difference between progressives and radicals. I tend to see there as being a greater difference between liberals and progressives, but I think this is a semantics issue as opposed to an issue of how do you clearly identify people into a group. But I think what happens in that is that you end up, the Democrats end up being in search of an economic philosophy to counter his, right? And his philosophy, when you get done looking at it, again, I would argue tariffs and his role that he's playing with government spending and playing a bigger role interfering with corporations, those all seem like kind of pretty far left, well, in my day, pretty far left policies. So a Mamdani shows up, and he's a democratic socialist, right? And all of a sudden he's talking about taking over grocery stores and trying to defund the police and doing all these things that socialists do. Then what happens in states where Democrats are more moderate, they have to confront the issue of, well, how do you feel about him?
Right.
And they're afraid to take him on because they have this part of their base in the Democratic primary that pretty strongly feels that he's a good guy. So they don't take him on. And now all of a sudden, Trump is able to say, even if he has a bad economy, well, you may not like he won't call them left policies, but my left policies. But look at how bad those guys are. You guys really want to go to socialism? These guys won't even oppose them. AOC, the same thing. Now, it's not lost on me. Donald Trump has one of the lowest approval ratings of any president. But here's what's really astonishing. Democrats are worse. Now, you can give a lot of arguments for that. But I would argue AOC and Mamdani are part of the reason they're worse, because there are a whole bunch of people who are more on the liberal side that are saying, not me. I'm out on that. I'm not going there.
I think you've hit it. You've hit all the points right on the head. I was one of before I became a politician, I was a donor. And as a donor, if you go back to what's happened in the Democratic Party since, let's say, 2016, I think they made two massive mistakes. And I've told them this as somebody who's from the Democratic Party. I said the first thing they've done is they've let Donald Trump define the entire agenda. And when the Democrats had the whole Russia ruin the election idea, you really can see that as being not in the national interest, and it wasn't and now you look back at it and you see it wasn't in the Democratic Party's interest. What would have been better in our time machine going back to 2016 or 2017 would have been to say, okay, we lost the 2016 election. Why did we lose? What can we do better? And then you would have gotten to some better policies. And then in that vacuum, you've had the rise of the progressives. So for 9 years now, the Democrats have lived, unfortunately, in this echo chamber where they just try to be opposite of whatever Trump is doing. So it's almost like Trump is running both political parties. And I've really been critical of that. I was the first donor to come out, for example, on Joe Biden rerunning for president. I said, look, it doesn't matter if he can win the election. He's probably not going to be vibrant until the year 2029. He's not going to be vibrant through the 26 midterms. He's not going to be vibrant with Putin. Like, let's just accept that, we should change things. So you really had, I think, a lack of leadership in the Democratic Party from what I would call the center. And I think that's what I'm trying to provide, which is some thinking, which is, what do we stand for as a party that we can now modernize and take back out to the voters so that we control our own destiny. You really can't worry too much about the plays that the other football team is running. You have to have your own plays. And then people can say, you score some points and you win. And so what's happened is you're seeing now in New York and Chicago, especially some of the other Democratic run cities, you're seeing that the leadership has no policies to run on nationally. It's like the farm team is not generating anybody because Chicago's not a great place to be. New York is not a great place to be. And so you're going to have this hole in the Democratic Party now that's because of these two mistakes that they made. And I'm trying very hard to fix those.
Okay, so I'm going to come to the fixing those because I think that plays an important role in this. My theory is just my political theory. I think with Clinton and Obama, the Democratic Party had two really good leaders. You can dislike them, but they were every bit as dynamic a leader as certainly Donald Trump is. They were able to pull their parts together. I think during the Obama period, what began to take place was that Democrats began to kind of form this theory that said, we can't be beat.
Right.
The Republicans can't do it, right? We've got this growing Hispanic population. We have an African-American population. The country is becoming more urban. The country is definitely, from a racial standpoint, moving more in the Democratic direction. And these Republicans only represent a very narrow base. Now, give Trump his due. He upset that. All right. He said, no. We're going to go after even some of your constituents. And he began talking about issues that in some respects appealed to at least the male portion of the Hispanic community and the African-American community, began to change those divides. It may be narrow, right? Meaning maybe the African-American population went from being 20% against or for Trump to 28% for Trump, but that's still 8% he picked up in the African-American population, Hispanic population, same type of thing. So I think hubris played a role in this. And Democrats now have become defeatist. The thing that amazes me about, let's call them the radicals, is I not only think they don't like our country, I think Mamdani and AOC, they don't like the United States, But truth be known, I don't think they like themselves all that much. Everything I hear from them is so negative and so polarizing. I can't really imagine how they could be attracting people the way that they are. But here's my question to you. Let's start just with New York and help me answer this question.
Mhm.
With that has been maybe one of the most progressive and in some cases extreme cases in the United States. If you were giving a lesson to other cities around the country, you've got to go in and try to clean it up and try to apply some business sense to it. But what are the lessons that you would give to the rest of the country that they should be thinking about just from an urban standpoint, not from a partisan standpoint, that they ought to try to avoid?
Wow, it's such a great question. And I'll go back to the $115 billion budget. So, good rule of thumb when I was looking at businesses over the years, and you can probably, anybody who's looked at the business community for the last, 30 or 40 years can understand this. There's this concept of the conglomerate. There used to be things called a conglomerate. There was a ITT, and ITT, they had insurance and they had this and they had that. And generally speaking, what the market has said is it's probably not better to be a conglomerate. It's better to specialize in, healthcare or specialize in TV or specialize, and even within, sectors, there are super specializations. It's almost like the more specialized you are in business, the better your chances are. So then you look at the city, and when you look at New York City, it's $115 billion budget. It's trying to do too much. It's there was this expression about 15 years ago called "too big to fail," where they talked about whether the banks were too big to let the government fail. But there's another way you could say that, which is it's too big to succeed. Something is just so unwieldy that it's too big to succeed. So I would say you got to go to some of the newer thinking. So, for example, Bill Ackman, who is closely aligned with President Trump, he was one of the people who came up with this idea that you give every newborn $1,000 when they're born, and then you let that accumulate. You had a guy named Andrew Yang who ran for New York mayor, and
Forward Party.
He was looking at something called the universal basic income, which is you give everybody who not doing too well, give them $1,000 a month, but you take away all the programs. Because the problem with the programs in New York is if you're trying to give somebody $800 or $900 a month of benefits, you're probably spending twice that to give it to them. And you got to go back all the way to the great, you're asking me advice about cities. Go back to the great Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, many people in the public don't know him, but he won the Nobel Prize for economics on a simple idea, which is if you take $1 and you spend it on yourself, you're getting $1 worth of value. You want a coffee, you get a coffee. Now, if I take $1 and I spend it on you, I might only get 70% cents of value because you might want an orange juice instead of a coffee. And if you spend $1 on me, it's only 70% efficient. But if I spend somebody else's money on somebody else, then I'm only getting 50% efficiency. And that's what the government does. The government is taking money from taxpayers and giving programs to other people. And it's not efficient. And then all of a sudden you have $115 billion where the budget of New York only, I think 15 years ago, was $40 billion. So the complexity just kind of takes over, and you're trying to say, we're here to take care of 8 million people. Well, you can't do that. It's impossible to take care of 8 million people. So I think what governments have to do at the municipal level is keep it simple, focus on the basics, and then you sort of put that scorecard. And I'm going to give you a specific example. So New York's school budget is at $40 billion. They spend $500,000 to get a kid from kindergarten to the 12th grade, but only half of the kids can read or write or do math at what's called grade level. So the consequence of that is that then you spend more money later to take care of these people who they have no chance to succeed, because if you can't read, write, or do math, you're going to be basically we're going to be right at that minimum wage. And it's because the Democrats haven't focused on the basics that they're creating more problems for later. They're attracting people who want the benefits instead of people who want to be self-sufficient. You really have to think hard as a municipality about what you're doing and say, if we can't do it really well, then we probably shouldn't get involved in it. And because then you'll do it badly and people will come to you for more. If you're giving out free food, people are going to come.
So a couple of months ago, somebody for The Atlantic wrote a story about how Arizona's running out of water. That's kind of the favorite story that people like to run on the East Coast to try to terrify people from coming out here. It's always kind of a funny story, but he kind of blasted Phoenix. So I wrote a response to it. And in the response, as it turned out, I was in New York that week. And by the way, let me start by saying this. I think New York is a cool city. There are many things about New York I really like. The second thing that I would say is I'm running around, there are rats all over the place. It's not lost on me, there are rats because they got a pile up of garbage out on the street. It's just piled up. Now, if anything like that happened in Phoenix, they wouldn't hang the mayor in effigy. They would hang the mayor. I mean, it's just like you wouldn't survive it.
I think that's a great way to evaluate a mayor. You've hit the nail on the head, which is there was a great mayor of Baltimore named Donald Schaefer. And he used to go around in his Lincoln Continental at night with a dictaphone. People remember what a dictaphone was. And if he saw something that was wrong, he would make a note and say, guys, get this junk off the street. And but what you get in New York is what I would call a culture of conceit. So what is a culture of conceit? New York thinks that it's a city state. It thinks of its leaders as being on a par with the president. So, for example, they go to Israel. Well, they go to Israel. What they're doing in Israel, I understand
they
why
have a foreign policy.
They have a foreign policy. Here's another one. They write federal laws. They wrote laws about immigration called sanctuary city laws that make no sense. So, we're going to have our own immigration policy. And then, what you get is instead of a clean sidewalk to walk on, is you get this lecture on overseas wars. So it's like they haven't read the city charter. And so what they tend to do is they become very expert on things that are hard to disprove. Like, thank God they understand Israel after 2,000 years. Nobody really understands it, but they luckily they've got it all worked out.
They can fix it,
but they can't pick up the trash. And now wait for it on the trash. The policy for the city of New York for the last 100 years is that you should put your private property, your trash, on a public sidewalk. And you're like, that makes no sense. It's like it's dumb. And so you have to say to the guys, look, if we're going to keep making these dumb mistakes, we're never going to get off to a start with the voters in the Midwest because everybody knows that's a bad idea.
So again, I was a Democratic mayor, and as a Democrat, I would have told them this. I'm an independent today. You have many wonderful attributes in your city. One of the biggest ones are your people. I mean, it's an innovative group of people, overwhelmingly. But your government is in the way.
Yes.
It's really in the way.
Yes.
Your rules, your regulation. They have more regulations. Arizona's at the bottom of the level on regulations. New York and New York City's at the top. And so what do you get? You don't get building inspectors that sound like the mob. You get building inspectors that are actually in the mob, right? I mean, it becomes incredibly problematic. And all of a sudden, who you're paying off starts to matter. And the rules and regulations that affect your businesses and young entrepreneurs trying to start something new gets in the way. If you get out of the way of your people and pick up your trash and make certain that the city is clean and take care of the petty crimes that are there and make certain that the homeless aren't sleeping on every single corner, you're going to change that city. But that's because you're going to release the power of the people that are inside of it. And you can't release the power of the people through government. You can only release it by making certain the government does what it has to do and get out of everything else.
Well, we're going to get into now some core political philosophies. I agree with 90% of what you said. Phoenix, or Arizona, however you want to put it, has a little advantage over New York in that it's all recently built. One of the problems in New
Yes.
York is, to build on your story about the building inspector, some of the older buildings in New York, they have this thing on the top of the building. It unfortunately fell off and somebody got hurt. So then every building in New York has to be inspected to make sure that this doesn't happen. And so you put up what are called the sidewalk sheds. You put up these scaffolding things. And then the city council came up with a rule that said, well, you have to take those down after 4 years, but they can't take them down because they're required to have them up. So you hit the nail on the head. But I think the core problem with New York, if you just think about like Democrats and Republicans, and I'm not trying to insult anybody because I'm kind of right in the middle, is Democrats like to win elections like Santa Claus. They like to come in with something. They come down the stairs with some present. It's got to be something, because Democrats like to think there are ways to make things better by government. Now, even if it's not true all the time, but they think it's the case. And we're going to talk about some examples where the government has made it better in a minute. And Republicans, they're not running like Santa Claus. They're like, we're going to do just what you said, which is we're going to get out of your way and let you do it. But the problem is the Democrats have lived for so long in a majority in New York, 100 years, that, imagine Santa Claus coming down with like so many presents that the whole thing, falls over, and the voters have gotten they've gotten addicted.
All right. So here's why I was interested in your campaign, what really attracted me to it. So I think oftentimes Democrats need role models on the other side. Now, right now, their role model is Trump is moving to the left, so we got to move further left. So it's the Democratic Socialist Party, which is going to add more rules, more regulations, more taxes, more government takeovers, and more problems. Now, I go back and I tell Democrats, why don't you take a look at Bill Clinton? Bill Clinton supported free markets, free trade. He supported a balanced budget. By balancing the budget, interest rates dropped. He was able to reach over and talk to those people in the center. Abortions ought to be, they ought to be safe, legal, and rare. He had a unique ability to talk to them, meaning you already have a role model. There are role models that can exist on the left. There's no rule that says that if Trump moves left, you got to move further left. There's just no rule that says that. The answer could be, no, there are principles here that have worked and our economy's done really well under. By the way, that's my big problem with what Trump is doing. He and Bernie Sanders and AOC work off of the same theory. Here's the theory. The United States is screwed. We're screwed. Whether it's the globalists or the billionaires, whichever one you want to blame, they've created this environment that have robbed our cities, killed our industry, destroyed our ability to have jobs. And here's the answer to that. There's nothing like the United States. No country has progressed as well as we have. No country has done more to promote human progress. And if you look at it from the period of time that free trade was being implemented under Reagan and Clinton to today, we were even with the other G7 nations in GDP per person back in 1992. We're double them today. Our lowest state, Mississippi, is higher than anybody else except for Germany. The point is, if you base it on the data as opposed to how you feel, you're going to come up with a different answer. But I really do think that progressives, and I think Donald Trump, have been promoting this idea that we're screwed, that things are terrible. The United States hasn't been performing well. I think if Democrats wanted to, they could go back to Bill Clinton and say, hey, here were some principles that we had as Democrats. And oh, by the way, they worked really well. We don't have to go socialist. Your thoughts on that?
You've hit the nail on the head. I think it'd be great for everybody in the country if they could go spend 6 months in a few different countries around the world. Well, I'm an unusual candidate because I spent 15 years living outside of the United States. I spent time in Eastern Europe. I have family in Russia. I've worked in Latvia. I'm probably going to be working in Ukraine. And people don't understand how good we have it, and how important it is that we take care of exactly what we have. So if you think of it this way, I like to think about it in sporting terms. And there's this argument about who the greatest basketball player is of all time. Is it LeBron James, or is it Michael Jordan, or is it Kobe Bryant? if you think about who the greatest Democrat is of all time, you start to create some role models for yourself. So you've mentioned Clinton. I would go further back to Franklin Roosevelt. And when you go back to the New Deal, which I have, and you go through what was the New Deal, like everybody, the New Deal, but what was it? There was not a single perpetual giveaway in the New Deal.
The WPA.
The New Deal created Social Security. Okay, now you might not like Social Security, but it's think about that. You have a rich guy in a wheelchair, and he creates a retirement accounts, and now you have 90 years later, it's probably helped people. You kind of look at it, and you may not like it. Maybe they could direct the assets, but it's been something that's really, it's a democratic idea that helped retirees from suffering. Okay, unemployment insurance. Well, that's okay. That's probably a good idea too. He created. I grew up in a village where the local school was built during the New Deal, but there were no perpetual giveaways, and that's where I draw the line from being kind of a Democrat to being a progressive. Because when you start to make it something where you're giving people something every year, then you're getting in the way of human nature. You're putting what we've built, which is we built with a frontier mentality. It's really un-American, and people don't like it. Now, if somebody needs help for a couple of years, I'm okay with that. But in New York, for example, we have 177,000 apartments that are called NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, that are perpetual housing for people. We have a city the size of Atlanta inside New York City, which is free housing forever. And that's where I think you really run into problems, because then what you get is, if you have people living in free housing, then the local schools aren't that good, and then you have local crime. And you have to go right back to the core thing that you said, which is what's made America great is this concept of self-sufficiency. And once you get away from self-sufficiency, it's like undermining everything. And that's where I have a disagreement with the progressives or the radicals, as I call them, because you can't put people on the hook. It's much better off to help them out temporarily and give them some paths to, if they're in a bad position, give them some paths to get some help. But you can't run people's lives. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, I think it's self-sufficiency and agency, which may be very similar. We're dealing with Charlie Kirk's assassination. Charlie was from Arizona. And what I find on both sides is that they want to take, on one hand, the assassin and blame a whole group of people for it, which is not much undifferent to what Democrats wanted to do when there were Democrats who were killed, or when the governor of Pennsylvania's home was caught on fire by somebody trying to fireball his entire family. But agency would say, no. That person who did that is responsible for that act. Not his mom, not his dad, not his brothers, not his sisters. He is, right? Not the political party that he might belong to. But at the same time, the other side wants to take this period of time of mourning where people on their side is hurting, and they say incendiary things. And there's no reason to. Allow the mourning to take place. It was somebody they cared about. And yeah, okay, he may disagree with you, but free speech becomes an important component to it. But if you believe, if you buy into the idea that it's not really about agency, it's really about our side versus your side. It's a battle of tribalism, and our side is good and your side is evil. Well, it's not long in that process before you start objectifying the other side. And as you begin to objectify them, then the things that you do to them actually become legitimate. I think most of the people who are involved in assassinations today actually have some type of mental psychosis today in the political shootings that have happened. But I think if you allow this to become an issue of blame, it isn't long before people who are tribal begin to believe they're protecting their side. And then the problem will get a lot worse and a lot more people will be engaged in. Again, this is a terrible thing.
It's a terrible thing. And, our thoughts go out to his wife and the kids and their extended family. And, what I've seen in, my short time in politics is that the, good leadership really matters. And by good leadership, I mean, first of all, it's good policies, which we're going to talk about in a second. I don't want to get past that. I think it starts with the policies. But, people do think of political leaders as leaders and role models. And I think you have to condemn violence at every step of the way. If you're older like I am, and I lived through 1968, I wrote about this, after the assassination of the CEO in New York in, I guess, December. 1968, things got out of control. People got hurt. We lost. We didn't just lose great people. There was something created called the generation gap, where the younger people didn't pay any attention to what their parents said, and the parents didn't understand what the kids were thinking. The United States suffered for that. And there's no reason for that. And there's no reason for, this is why I named our ballot line the Unity Party ballot line. And so,
talk to me about that, if you would. The Unity Party, the policies that you're trying to advocate for. Let's use that as a transition point here.
Well, let's come to what I call political science questions, which is now you've got a society of 350 million people in the United States. You've got 8 million people in New York City. And, when you step back, you have to think about, well, what can you do? People kind of had this urge to make things better. I go back to FDR. So when I look at the flaws in the society right now, I go back to my days when I was a gardener. And imagine that you have a big tree, a big oak tree, and you have a swing on it. It can't be prettier. But everybody knows you don't put a swing on a tree that's 1 year old. It'll just break the tree. So I want to treat our 10-year-olds to 25-year-olds differently in the tax code. I want the 10-year-olds and their parents and the teachers to be given a target when the kids are 25 years old, which is, I want to give every 25-year-old back $25,000 from the government of the taxes that they paid from age 10 to 25. Basically, I'm saying no taxes until you're 25. You're a young tree. We need to water you. We need to plant you the right way. We need to make sure that you're going to be set up when you're 25 to do a couple of things. One is you got to file your taxes. 2 is you got to be voting. You got to vote 80% of the time. And 3 is can't be in jail to get this. So imagine that you're working at McDonald's and I'm trying to get at the 13-year-olds, the 14-year-olds. You're working at McDonald's. You earn $200. You come home and you have $130 in your paycheck because of all the things that taken out. I want to turn that into a game for the kids. I want to turn that into a game where the kids can go online and they can say, I have $70 over here in this account. And the next week they have $140, and the next week they have $200. And by the time they're 25, they've accumulated capital. They've accumulated financial acumen. They've created a sense of agency, to take your word, or self-sufficiency, which is how I look at it. And we've given a tool to the schools and the moms and dads at the kitchen table to create a mutual goal for our society, which is we want to create great 25-year-olds. Like that, I'm not that religious of a person. And I think if you were a Muslim, or if you're a Christian, or if you're Jewish, everybody would agree on this, which is if we create great 25-year-olds, you're kind of good to go. Because then what happens is when you're 25 and you've got $25,000 in your pocket and you've earned some money and you voted and you filed, you're good to go. Like, we don't have to worry about you. The one we have to worry about is the one who's they're not off to a good start. Maybe school wasn't for them. They don't file their taxes. They're kind of they're always in debt. And then the government ends up taking care of them for the next 50 years, which creates this massive budget problem. So think of it this way. Think of it as a social security system or an IRA system, but for young people. And then what happens is on your 26th birthday, we're going to say, now now you're an adult.
Can the city do this on their own, or would you see this as a federal program?
This is the beauty of New York. And if you understand, strategy, you always have to take your strengths and weaknesses and work with them. One of the weaknesses of New York, it's a great weakness, is we have a very high income tax, but that can be a strength. So I want to cut that income tax, but instead of cutting it for everybody, I want to focus it in on the young people first, because I think it has the biggest bang for the buck. If we get the kids
That's creative.
set up the right way. So in the case of New York, if you earn $250,000 by the age of 25, which is $25,000 a year, it's not an impossible target. You might have $20,000 to $25,000 of taxes taken out of your paycheck, and we would give that to you. But here's the catch: you can get that for a home purchase. The taxes that you pay the state and the title fees and all that, you can get that. So it will help you to become a homeowner or apartment owner. You can get it to pay off a student loan. You can get this for retraining. You want to become a dentist, or you want to become a steam fitter, and you can just put it in your retirement account. Now the example of this that is all over the United States are the state university systems. So we have it in New York called the SUNY system, State University of New York. In California, it's University of California, Los Angeles, whatever. So the theory of the state university systems is that the younger people who are from in-state pay lower tuitions. And so what the state university systems do is they take kind of normal 18-year-olds and they turn them into more well-qualified 23-year-olds. And more qualified 23-year-olds pay more taxes over their lifetime. So in New York, I'll give you an example. There's the State University of New York system in Buffalo, which is practically in Ohio, but it's in New York. They have a school for, I bought these eyeglasses through my eye doctor, went to SUNY Buffalo, and they turned what I would call, kind of a normal person into an eye doctor. Well, now she's earning $120,000 a year being an eye doctor. Well, guess what? The state gets that back in tax revenue because she's a higher performer. So when you look at the problem that we have to get at as a world, we have the globalization of wages, and we have robotics and AI that are driving down wages. We have to figure out how to make our society more valuable in the long run, like Singapore did. So you have to do that with the young people. You can also do it with the old people.
What are the short-term budgetary impacts on that, and how do you address that?
Well, the young people don't pay that much in taxes. It's a tax cut. It's a targeted tax cut. You're just going to write checks. Like if I win and you're 26 in New York, I'm going to give you a check for $25,000. I'm going to look back at your last 10 years and I'm going to just give it to you. And, we'll have beneficiaries. You would cap it, because let's say you're some genius kid and you're earning millions of dollars. You don't need our help. You're already what I call you're a young tree that is now a mature tree. We want to get at the kids, 10, 12, 11, 13 years old. And there's a second part to this, which is even better, which is I want the parents to have a perpetual rebate on their kids' taxes. So if your kid pays $30,000 a year of taxes, I want you to get a check from the government for $3,000, because you were the one at the kitchen table when the kid was 11 years old, telling the kid, you got to go to school, you got to study. We as a society are the unity. Back to the question you asked. The unity of our mission is that we should try to grow great 25-year-olds, and the progressives don't want to do that. They want to grow 25-year-old dependents. And it's very sad, because if you then take what Mamdani wants to do is, instead of fixing that, he wants to give them a bag of potatoes and a bus pass. It's like, I call him Mr. Potato Head, because, if your remedy for somebody who can't earn more than the minimum wage because they went to a bad school and you never taught them how to earn money is you're going to put them on a bus for free and give them a bag of cheap potatoes, you're a disgrace. You should get out of here. I don't want to hear about you. But now everybody wants to hear about Mamdani. So there are things you can do with the tax policy that we're not doing yet. And just I'll finish, because the reason these things weren't done before is because in the old days when they collected the taxes, the computers were in these buildings, these big computers. It just had to be something simple where they're just collecting the taxes from everybody. But now the computers are smart enough to say, look, here's this guy, he's 25. He earned all this money. We're going to give it back to him. And then now he starts earning money. We're going to send his mom a check. The computers are smart enough to do it.
What do you see the role being for the position you're running for on crime and law enforcement?
We need more cops in New York, number one. Number two, cops need to be backed by the mayor and the leaders of the city. I call it the software or the glue. I worked as a carpenter, and when you screw a table together, you actually got to put glue everywhere so that the table doesn't wobble. So, the mayor needs to come out and say, I'm backing the guys, the ladies, whoever's enforcing the law. And then I think what the public advocate can do, there's a lot of public education to do, which is the police have been demonized. There's been some bad actors in the police. We see the videos. But think of it this way. The core problem, the way policing works is you have one cop for every 300 people. The only way that can work is if the 300 people agree to be policed, because otherwise you can't run around and police the people. So if you break that social contract, you make it impossible. So I think you need to reinforce the social contract between the community and the cops. In the short term, you need to put in more cops. I happen to be a director of a company that's in the facial recognition business. And I think you have, in New York, for example, there are 63 criminals, 63 guys, mostly guys, who terrorize the subway system. 63 people. If you went out and picked them up and got rid of them, you'd have like half the problem solved, but they don't have the willpower to do it. So I think you need to go back to basics and say, look, our job is, the schools, we have to make the schools better. Get some help from the tax system, make the schools better. We need to back the police, because without law and order, you don't have anything. And, we need to teach the communities and the police about the fact that they need to work together. And then you need to use technology to get the bad actors out of the streets.
Yeah, here's what I saw on the police issues. First, I agree with you in terms of supporting the police. Not just about the problem isn't just the folks who want to defund the police; it's the people who want to demoralize them,
right?
Who want to blame them for every single problem in society. The second one is they apply racism to everything that a police officer does, and this was my experience. I'm not going to say that there weren't police officers that did things that they shouldn't have done. I had a few of those cases. They definitely existed. But when you blame racism for everything, you begin to make it more difficult to be able to resolve the problem. So as an example, there was a show back during that period of time, even before the 90s, it was called Serpico, which was about a police officer who was an undercover agent. He ended up telling on other police officers. And when he told on the other police officers, they actually got him shot. And that created this movement inside police departments to stop neighborhood-based policing, because the theory was, as these police officers became too familiar with neighbors, they might shake them down. Well, the challenge with that is that you created a division between police officers and the neighborhood. And oftentimes, if you can get a neighborhood who wants to clean up their neighborhood, who doesn't want the crime, if you can get them connected to the police officer, you get a better neighborhood, you get better neighbors, and you get better police enforcement. And we ran some experiments on this. There was just no doubt that there's a connection if you end up pulling them both together. But if you blame it on racism, if when a problem happens, you immediately say, this problem was caused by racism, well, you're going to miss the real underlying factors that might have existed that might help you fix the problem. That doesn't mean that sometimes there aren't issues that are racist that need to be dealt with. I'm not trying to take away from that. What I'm saying is that they blame everything on it, and it's always the police officer's fault. And when you start there, you are going to fail on coming up with making your city safer. You have to see neighbors and police officers both as assets to fight crime. And the more you connect the two of them, the better off you're going to be in being successful.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. So I have behind me a map of 2 of New York City's boroughs, and I'm going to take your listeners and you on this is what I call the hot dog problem. So the hot dog problem is when you buy hot dogs, you get 10 hot dogs, but when you buy buns, you only get 6 buns. So then you have to buy 12 buns and you have 10 hot dogs, and you keep buying until you get the same amount. So these maps are divided up into 77 police precincts, 58 community boards, and 51 city council seats. Now, call me crazy, but wouldn't it be easier if there were just like, say, 62 of everything and they all had the same borders? So, for example, up over here, you might have a city council district that has 3 different police precincts and 3 different community boards. So it's a harder thing. You ask me as public advocate, what I would do is when I look at the city, I'm like, well, if let's say for argument's sake, you had 62 sub areas, whatever you want to call them, but the community boards, the city council, and the police all had the same borders. And then let's say you had a local person who was, locally elected, which is not the case in New York. So the community boards are appointed by the borough president in New York. So you're disconnecting the people from the local unit. What I'm calling for in the long term is to take the hot dogs and the buns and have the same number of hot dogs and the same number of buns, where you have 62 areas, and then you make the leaders of those areas locally elected instead of appointed by patronage. And then we can do exactly what you said, which is then you almost create like 62 villages, within New York City, where, I'll give you another example, which is because it's not done that way, they have something in New York called the 311 system. Now, the 311 system is you dial 311 and you make a complaint. But 95%, and they would come to the public advocate. So 95% of the complaints are local complaints. And the reason they're coming, it's like having, you ever had a vacuum cleaner where the brush doesn't turn, and so you end up with a broom? It's like, because you have a non-functioning vacuum cleaner of the 62 areas, it all comes to the public advocate. So what I'm saying is, like, I understand that's the problem, but what we got to do in the long run is we create 62 local areas that are coherent, where the local leadership and the police and can solve problems and do what you said, which is create a bond between the local policeman and the community. And you'll always have bad actors. It's unfortunate when you have any big enterprise, you're always going to have bad actors. But I think that's where you have to start, which is you have to reinforce the relationship between the community and the police, and the leaders of the city need to make that crystal clear.
All right. Any other policies you want to cover before I'm going to go back to political science for just at the end of the show here, but any other items you want to cover?
Yeah. So we're going to talk about public housing.
All right. I'd love to talk about public housing, and I'd love to try to understand how you think rent controls and those types of things have played into it, and what type of reforms might help be successful at creating more affordable housing for people in New York.
So I'm against rent control.
Hooray.
There's no city anywhere in the world where it's been proven that rent control lowers rents. In fact, the opposite happens. What happens is rents go up. And if my whole theory is that the city should do less, I think they don't need to be so much in the housing business. I think the less interference, the better. So there are all kinds of laws in New York about if you fix up your apartment, you can't raise the rent. It's nuts. People go crazy, trying to figure it out. So now this is a problem that I call like having water in your basement. If you ever woke up and had water in your basement, You're like, why do I have water in my basement? You complain about it, but the reality is, you gotta get the water out of your basement first. You just have to. You have to get it out right away, and that's the problem. Is we have too much public housing in now. Public housing is one of these things where, and here I'll give President Trump some credit, because he has an instinct that anything that's been around for a long time, you could look at it and probably see a better way to do it. So public housing was better than the ghetto. Or supposed to be better than the ghetto, and the ghetto was better than the Deep South. Those things might have been true 50 years ago or 120 years ago, but public housing now is terrible. And what it does is it creates the problems in the schools. So, which gets back to the 10 to 25-year-olds. If you want to grow great 25-year-olds, you can't do it in public housing. You can't, because there are people in public housing who've lived in public housing for 75 years in New York, and they pay $100 a month, and they're not going anywhere. So what we have to do is create a path to solve this. And my proposal is that, imagine you have a $150,000 apartment, which in some of the public housing in New York is not great. So there might be a $150,000 apartment. I want to go to the people there and say, especially the families. Now, if you're an older person, I understand, you're not impacting the school system, but I want to offer you $40,000 of what I call a transferable equity voucher and an $80,000 mortgage, and for a $150,000 apartment. So basically, you can have a $70,000 of equity in this apartment, or $40,000 of cash. You can keep the apartment. You can sell it to a developer. You can take the cash and move out. And now I have an apartment that I could probably rent out, not for $300 a month, but for $2,000 a month, which is what I need. I need more apartments in New York. I need more free market apartments. So it's like a great big condo conversion for the entirety of New York City. And you get 177,000 apartments, and you just take it down, and you create what in business we call as an exit route. If you don't have an exit route for a policy, and it might not think this would work, but if you go back to my experience working with, I worked with the cleaning up the environment. And I remember when I was in high school, I asked the first secretary of the EPA, who was a guy named William Ruckelshaus, Mr. Secretary, how long will it take to fix the environment? And he goes, well, a good rule of thumb is it takes as long to fix a problem as it did to create it. Mr. Secretary, are you saying it's going to take 75 years to 100 years to fix the environment? And he goes, yes, it probably will. So I think that's where we are with public housing, which is, this is a problem that's been created over 75 years. But it doesn't mean that you can't solve it. It just means you need to be patient, and you need to be, persistent. The environment is a lot better now than it was in 1974. There's no question about that. And it's been a lot of, little wins. But I want New York 20 years from now to have 75,000 public apartments, and later on have 25,000, because you can't build great 25-year-olds if the example is that the city is here to provide for you for the rest of your life with public housing.
Yeah, and public housing has lots of challenges to it. In my experience, what I found with it, I worked with Jack Kemp back during the period of time that he worked with the Reagan administration, and we looked at what we could do with housing to first try to move people out. And what started to become really clear to me, I was astonished, even back then in the 1990s, how much more money it cost for government to build an apartment unit than it did for the private sector to build an equivalent type unit.
Yeah.
And yet the public unit ended up being destroyed 3 or 4 times faster than the private units did. Now, that was partly because the private manager would do a better job of upkeep. It was partly because they would throw people out who destroyed property. They wouldn't put up with people doing things that they shouldn't do. And the challenge in the public housing wasn't everybody being a bad actor, but you don't need everybody being a bad actor.
Right.
You get 3% of them being a bad actor, and they make it worse for everyone else that's there. So anything that you could do, it became so clear to me, anything that you could do to privatize it, to
Yes.
get it out of the hands of government,
Yes.
and to spread people out and to put them into environments where not everybody else was on public housing or on public welfare, was going to be beneficial to the entire community, but certainly to those families who began learning different mores and standards and values that oftentimes you won't get in a public housing project where 3% of the people are causing so many problems. You don't want to live there, but you're going to stay because it's the only place you can afford.
It becomes a bit of a addiction. And I'm going to tell, if we have time, I'll tell a story that was really like transformative for me. When you're collecting petitions to get on the ballot, it's a challenge because it's hard to stop people in the street, but you want to go to tall buildings because then you're inside and you get the signatures. So you go to the projects, and the people in the projects are always home. So you're knocking on doors to get signatures; they're always home. Well, that's not good. You don't want to always be home. You want to be out at work and come home. But in I'm trying to see where it is in the Bronx, right here, right there. There's an area called the Bruckner Boulevard. You probably never heard of it, but it's filled with public housing. Filled with public housing. That's where they put the expressway, and then they put public housing on each side. Which, it's too bad they did that. So I was collecting signatures there. And you go through the building, and then you take a break and you get the signatures. But then I was collecting some signatures in the street across from public housing, literally on the same street across from public housing. And I was getting signatures, and then you ask the people their name, and you say to them, "What apartment number is that?" And they stand up and they're like, "That's my house. That's my house." They have agency. They don't live in apartment 17R. They live at 1722 Lafayette Avenue, and they look at you like, that's my house. And I'm telling you, in this part of the Bronx, it's not like they're palaces, but they have their own house. Now, like somebody who has their own house pays taxes. They vote. They take their kids to school and say, you got to get an education. Like they're on top of their lives. So, and it was like a moment when I was like, okay, like you can't have a building full of people who are wards of the state. And across the street in exactly the same community, you have people they're like, that's my house. You want the other thing. You want people to be proud of their own lives and to be strong trees. But to get that, you have to plant them right.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who are living in public housing, they were badly planted, and now they're being given these bad messages by the progressives, which is, oh, you poor people. And I'll tell you one more thing, just because I've had this conversation with the community leaders. The community leaders have said, we can't do it. We don't know how to do it. And I was like, yes, you can. Like, absolutely, you can. You're gonna, there'll be some people who get ripped off. There'll be some things we have to have some safeguards, but they're so far. They've been so put down for so long by the government that they think that they can't do it. They think of themselves as second-class citizens, and I want to end that. I don't think that's acceptable. And the progressives, the radicals, you're a second-class citizen. You can't do it. We're going to give you a free bus pass and cheap potatoes. And it's like, this is not American. This is for the birds.
Do you think that as you're out there campaigning, that people, especially in a city that everyone keeps saying to me they're going to vote for Mamdani, do you think that they're also willing to accept the balance for this public advocate to make certain that they have somebody who's watching out after their money while the socialist is doing the best he can to spend it?
Well, I got 90,000 votes in the June primary. So as it running up for the Democrats. So obviously there's some people who think that's the case. Unfortunately, and you've never heard of him, but you've heard of AOC. AOC got 20,000 votes to get elected to Congress last year against me. She got 20,000 votes. Bernie Sanders, look it up. the most votes that Bernie Sanders has ever gotten in Vermont, which is, you could fit Vermont into Arizona, 20 times. The most votes Bernie Sanders has ever gotten is like 200,000 votes. Now, the problem I have is that the current public advocate is the leading national vote getter for the Democrat Socialists of America. He's the number one threat. He gets over 600,000 votes because New York's a big place. There's a lot of people there. So the question for me is not whether I feel good about what I'm doing. It's, do I have enough time and money to kind of get the word out? And that's the challenge. But you've never heard of Jumaane Williams, but he gets more votes for the radicals. He got more votes than Mamdani. And all the guy does is he goes around and love beads and makes it's okay, guys. It's okay. It's all racial. It's all because of racism. And you're like, they're smarter. The voters are smarter than that. I have to get to as many of them as possible.
Again, there's a victim mindset that's been built out on the progressive side, and I'm not gonna cut any slack for the Trump people. I think he's preaching a message to them that is pretty much about them being victimized. And when people believe they've been victimized, they lose their agency. When you lose your agency, you believe that the actions that you take can't affect your future. And in everything that I've seen in life and in politics, it can. One of my favorite guys is Viktor Frankl, who talks about being an Auschwitz. And his whole point that he makes in being an Auschwitz was he still had choices. He still was able to make choices. And his whole practice was designed around convincing people, of course you have agency. So tell me, when you ran against AOC, actually you ran against two of the people on the squad. I kind of think that's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
But what is the message that you think she's giving to people about the Democratic Party throughout the country? And how might that be different in her district?
Well, you gotta, I'll just take you through the journey of your listeners' minds. And, when you ask somebody what their favorite baseball team is, they might like the Chiefs, or they might like the Cowboys, or they might like, the Yankees. That's kind of how it is with politicians. Like, I'm a Yankees fan, but there's no real reason why I'm a Yankees fan. I just grew up near Yankee Stadium. And I've got a little switch in my head that says, I'm not going to be a Pittsburgh Pirates fan. I'm a Yankees fan. And that's kind of how it is with politics, which is once people, feel like they identify with a candidate, it's just a thing like that. They like a movie star, or they like to go for coffee at this place, but not the other place, or they're like, people like what they like. And people are busy. People don't. They kind of have this thing where they're supposed to make a political decision, and once they make it, they're like, okay, I don't want to think about this again. I think President Trump has been a remarkable achiever in that respect. Like he's gotten into people's heads, and he's like, people feel good. The ones who back him, they feel really good about being with Trump. I'm going to tell you a story about Trump, and then I'm going to come back to AOC. So, Trump had a rally in New York.
I do.
He had it in a place called Crotona Park, which it's in the Bronx. It's not in like the most nicest part of New York. And I learned, when I was a runner, I was a cross country runner for my coach. You have to go scout where you're going to be. So I went to scout Crotona Park 4 days before Trump was going. 4 days. There were people there in red shirts. There was a truck driver
waiting.
Yeah, because he just felt good about Trump. He just felt like, and he was there, and I was like, well, you're here 4 days early. He goes, yeah, I wanted to get a good seat. And I think, AOC has some of that with her audience. Now, they're a good comparison because there's a lot of things that I don't like about Trump, and there's many things that I don't like about AOC. And so we'll talk like in terms of, she, I think, is a role model for a lot of young women. You got to start there. Like women feel like they've been kept out of the game for 10,000 years. It's a long time. And so there are a lot of people, especially older women, who really like that she's out there fighting. They just like it. I'm not saying they like it for substance, but they like it. They really feel like in their head, like that she's great to like. She's very, AOC is always on camera, so she finds a good way to always be on camera. But her policies are absolutely terrible. They're absolutely terrible, and she does know what's called district service. So her policies are pretty much, oh, you poor people. That's the Democratic policy right now, which is you poor people. If you can't do it, we're going to give you more, which is the opposite of what I'm saying. And then the thing that really, I think, we all know locally is that she does no district service. And by that, I mean, she doesn't have an office in the district. And I was a member of there's an area in Queens called Roosevelt Avenue, which it's underneath the train. And when we had the 200,000 illegal immigrants come to New York, a lot of them came to Queens because in Queens, everybody speaks all the different languages. And then we had the crime and we had the prostitution and we had 2 cops shot. So when we had 2 cops shot, AOC was at Columbia University, celebrating with the protesters. And she didn't care that 2 cops were shot in her district. So she really doesn't care about her district at all. Her district is just,
means to an end.
It's just a means to an end. And so she kind of plays herself as this national figure. I think she's a terrible congressional representative, but people keep voting for her.
This is my my theory of AOC, and for that matter, I put Trump in a very similar category. A long time ago, I had a dinner with a guy named Pierre Salinger, who wrote speeches for President John F. Kennedy. The famous words, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." He wrote those words. He would deny it when you asked him, but people pretty much knew that that was kind of his special skill set. So as it turned out, I ended up having dinner with him and Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan was telling these great stories. We were in the back kitchen waiting for the speech that Reagan was going to give. This was after Reagan had left the presidency, and then when Reagan left to go to bed, I will never forget, Pierre Salinger says, "Oh my gosh, that Ronald Reagan, he's just like John F. Kennedy." And I said, "What are you talking about? That Ronald Reagan is just like John F. Kennedy?" He said, "No." He said, "Look," he said, you're going to find this in politics." He said, "There are people who have a very bad view of the United States, and there are people who have a very optimistic view of the United States." He said they both have an incredibly optimistic view about who we are. They just have a different way that they're trying to solve the problem.
Right.
I think that I kind of break people into 2 different groups. And there's one group of people who believes that the United States is a great cause for good, but they think we do things wrong every now and then. And there's another group. The other group thinks the United States is evil, and every now and then we get lucky and we just do something right. And I kind of put AOC in camp 2. I don't think she likes who we are. What I hear from her is very, very rarely any compliment about who the United States is and what we do and the values that Western democracy have brought to the world. I think her view over Western democracy, I think if she had to choose between us and for that matter, Hamas, I think she'd say Hamas's values are equally relevant to the world than Western values are, and that there are no good values and bad values, kind of an Edward Said type of point of view. There's just different values. And my answer to that is, that's bullshit. There are some values that are better than other values. It's just that simple. I would utilize the issue of human rights as one of them. The fact that, are we perfect on human rights? Of course not. We have problems on the human rights issues or civil rights issues or equal rights. But the question always should be asked, compared to who? Compared to when? Right? And the answer to that is, the United States is a great cause for good that every now and then does something that you go, ooh, that I don't feel comfortable with that. That doesn't seem to me what we should be doing.
I think you hit the nail on the head, which is that a lot of the people who are behind what I call the far left, the radicals, they're not well traveled. I've lived in 6 different countries. I've spent 15 years outside the United States. I understand the difference between having a croissant in France and actually seeing what life is like for the people in France. And as you pointed out, the state of Mississippi's GDP per capita is now greater than Italy's, and it's not far from Germany's, and that's because of the American system. And when I had this conversation with some of my friends in Russia, and we got into it a little bit. They're like, Russia's contributed so much to the world. And I was like, okay, let's have that conversation. There's no area of the world that's ever contributed as much to the world as the American Midwest. Okay? The American Midwest has been the most fruitful area in world history for example, airplanes were invented in the American Midwest. Movies, the patent law, you go on and on and on. All the engineering that ended up in Silicon Valley started, in the Midwest, and it started from freedom and education. So I agree with you that the progressives, I call them the radicals, AOC in particular, they're just not well traveled. They've never traveled outside of their district, and they're pitching to people who aren't well traveled, and that's the story that they want to hear. You would think people would know better, but it's hard to, some of the people who live in the Bronx, for example, they don't, that's their life. They just can only see what's there. And they're going to believe if somebody tells them this, then they're kind of somebody they respect. They're going to believe it. And if you grew up working in Oregon in a sawmill, you might think the same things. I mean, the more that we get people to travel around the country and understand how great America is. Now, I'm not running for a federal office, but if I was, I would put in a national jobs program for young people, just like that. I think if we can get the 18-year-olds in New York working in the Midwest and the kids in the Midwest coming to New York, I think those are the sort of things when you talk about unity. What does unity mean? Unity for me means that we're one country and that we have civics and that we understand it. And, I've traveled a lot. You've probably traveled a lot. There's nothing like taking somebody from, one community and just letting them see, what it's like someplace else. And they come back with a different perspective. So I'm not running for a federal office, but if I was running for a federal office, I'm not saying there's going to be national service. This is the United States. You can't force people, but I'd have a national jobs program for young people and get them moving around. And I'd say you have to be at least 1,000 miles from home. And we would be a better country if that was the case.
All right. So we're kind of reaching the end of our hour and a half here. If you would, why don't you, if people wanted to support you, why don't you give me the website that they might go to and what are the rules in New York in terms of contributions?
Sure. So you can go to martydolan.org. So somebody had already taken martydolan.com and they wanted me to buy. I'm not going to buy them. I'm going to buy martydolan.org. You can see what we're talking about in terms of my policies. The most you can contribute is $3,700. But what I found in politics is it's like building a spider web. Spider webs are never perfectly round. Like the spider finds a place to hang on here and another place over here. So whatever way people can contribute, we would welcome it. We've had people contribute with ideas. Some people contribute with money. So it's martydolan.org. And on Instagram, I'm Marty Dolan NY. And our election is on November 4th. And I'm devoted to just being myself, sticking to my policies, and then we'll see how we do.
All right, Marty, we'll keep an eye on the election, and I'll definitely send you a contribution of my own.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being on our show, Marty, and again, Godspeed.
My pleasure. Keep up the good work.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.